it became pretty clear that these folks were not going to leave in a day or two.
I think that people were being told to be a lot more worried than the situation warranted.
In fact, it was excessively intimidating.
People were coming out and supporting this because they knew they had to.
And the potential for destruction was huge.
So our original plan was to stay until all mandates were lifted.
The folks who live in the downtown core were terrorized.
It was clear there was no justification.
Well, they really misjudged the moment.
I think that's going to be a big problem for the government.
It's clear that Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act as a political tool.
It became pretty clear that these folks were not going to leave in a day or two.
I think that people were being told to be a lot more worried than the situation warranted.
In fact, it was excessively intimidating.
People were coming out and supporting this because they knew they had to.
And the potential for destruction was huge.
So our original plan was to stay until all mandates were lifted.
The folks who live in the downtown core were terrorized.
It was clear there was no justification.
Well, they really misjudged the moment.
I think that's going to be a big problem for the government.
It's clear that Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act as a political tool.
It became pretty clear that these folks were not going to leave in a day or two.
I think that people were being told to be a lot more worried than the situation warranted.
In fact, it was excessively intimidating.
People were coming out and supporting this because they knew they had to.
And the potential for destruction was huge.
So our original plan was to stay until all mandates were lifted.
The folks who live in the downtown core were terrorized.
It was clear there was no justification.
Well, they really misjudged the moment.
I think that's going to be a big problem for the government.
It's clear that Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act as a political tool.
It became pretty clear.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special presentation by True North. It's not often that we get to roll out the virtual red carpet and premiere a film. In fact, I don't think we've ever done that, either the film or the red carpet, virtual or otherwise. But we are doing exactly that tonight. And I am so very thrilled to have one of my colleagues in particular taking a front and center role in telling a story that is near and dear to my heart and to those of many in our audience, and I would say to those of Canada as well. And the one thing that I want to just say before we get into the meat of what we're all here for, which is the premiere of the documentary, The Freedom Occupation, is that this is coming coincidentally on the eve of the release of the Public Order Emergency Commission's report into a lot of the things that are going to be discussed in the film and discussion that you're going to see tonight. So all of that is to say that we have a fantastic discussion planned for you this evening. I'm joined by filmmakers Rachel Emmanuel and Johnny Emmanuel, who are the producers of this and really the stars of the evening program, and also my colleague at True North, Rupa Subramanya, who, like me, has the great privilege of being featured in the documentary. Both Rupa and I were interviewed for this, although I deliberately have not seen it yet. And we're going to have a discussion beforehand. We're going to watch it all together, and we're going to have a discussion afterwards, and it will be very authentic on my part. So if they've taken me out of context and photoshopped me into something very weird, I'll be seeing it for the first time alongside you. But you can watch this all at the Freedom Occupation's website, which is freedomoccupation.ca, and you can see tonight in full, in just about 25 minutes or so, the Freedom Occupation, the movement that fueled a nation. So without further ado, let's get this discussion going, and I want to start with you, Rachel, and you, Johnny. Now, I should say True North is distributing this. We're thrilled to be doing that, but this was an initiative that you both took on your own to tell this story. So I don't know which one of you wants to take this first, but why did you do it?
Well, I'll jump in, and Johnny, if you have anything to add, you can certainly add that afterwards. Initially, it was just because a couple months after the Freedom Convoy had ended, I actually was living in Alberta at this time, and at this point, I started to hear there was a couple groups that were working on documentaries, and I was just thinking about all the really amazing footage that I had on my phone. I was one of the arguably few reporters that was at the very front when police actually came and pushed protesters out of Ottawa and off of Parliament Hill. And I had some really incredible footage of that. Now, I wasn't actually very well known as a reporter at that time. I was still working in the mainstream media for a pretty small and unknown outlet, iPolitics. And those videos actually didn't get very much traction online. If I had posted them now with the following that I had, I think they would have certainly taken off and gone viral. So they actually hadn't been seen very much. And I just thought, man, like, it would be great if I could do something with this. And conveniently, my brother Johnny was studying film, and he was just about to finish at Fanshawe with a degree in film studies, which was something that he is very passionate about and had been learning about for years. So I just reached out to him and I said, hey, would you be interested in working on this project with me? I don't think we really realized how big it was going to get or how much work it was going to take, but it was kind of convenient that he had all this necessary skills, and I had some footage, but also a lot of the contacts that we needed to really get this project underway.
Johnny, why were you wanting to get involved in this?
Well, it was really convenient in the sense that, as Rachel mentioned, I was just coming out of school. I had just wrapped up some solo projects of myself that I had done in school, and I was kind of thinking, like, what next? What's the next challenge? And it was actually at our end of the year film festival where Rachel shot me a text and was like, hey, I have an idea. Like, I have this footage. What do you think of making this a possibility? And it was just like the stars aligned. It was like, absolutely, let's make it happen. And here we are.
I know that you've seen this yourself, and I've certainly seen it, so let's just deal with the elephant in the room right away. The name. So, as you well know, occupation is a somewhat of a loaded term, and I've seen some people that are probably supportive of the convoy that have said they question, or in some cases might not like that choice. So what is it you're trying to convey, and what do you mean when you come out with the title, The Freedom Occupation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. When Jonathan and I discussed this project and agreed that we were going to do it, it was very important to us that we get both sides of the story. Now, obviously, working in center-right conservative media, you know, I obviously have a bias, and I don't hide that to viewers or to my audience. It's very obvious where I'm coming from. But to me, it was very important that we do get both sides of the story and really talk to people who are impacted on both sides, of here people who lived in Ottawa and businesses and business owners, as well as people who had their rights stripped away from them and were a part of the convoy. So I think for me, the name is really a conversation starter. I want people to see this documentary and be interested. They know that True North is distributing it. Obviously, my name is attached to it. People know who I am. Some people, not everybody. So I think it's a conversation starter. I think people look at this name and be like, huh, what do they really mean by that? And I think the name really pays homage to the fact that we did want to show both sides of the story. I think when you watch the documentary, you'll see that. We actually had some people come back to us who watched it and said they thought we were too hard on the convoy at times, or we portrayed too many people who were anti-convoy. Of course, we had other people who said the opposite. It's been very interesting actually getting feedback on this project, how different opinions people have so far. So I'm really excited to see how it goes over. But, and I think the other interesting thing is also just sort of the unique wordplay within the word occupation. These are people, and my brother was actually the person who pointed this out, who said they made it their job to go to Ottawa and be heard for the fact that their restrictions and their liberties were taken away. And Andrew, I 100% agree with you that the term occupation has become a very loaded term, but I think it's also worth asking the question that if we're talking about a breach of civil liberties to the magnitude that we are, where people were actually being forced to put a foreign substance into their body that they were not comfortable with, and certainly we've learned a lot about what that substance is in recent days, and there's a lot of cause to be concerned. Would an occupation not be worth it at that cost then to go to Ottawa and to be heard? So I think really for us, it was a conversation starter. And I think the funny thing is that it also kind of annoys both groups, because you can't use the word freedom around people that are left wing nowadays without them being triggered. It's like a dirty word to them now, which is super funny. And like you mentioned, occupation has become a very loaded, dirty word for people in right wing circles now.
Yeah, that's a great point. So by the end of it, you'll have either alienated both sides, or perhaps you'll have found the sweet spot, and both sides will love it. Let's discuss this from the film perspective for a moment, because Johnny, you know better than anyone with your background that there was so much in the way of compelling visual in the convoy, and you had so many people that were actually filming video, that were just on their own as streamers, as citizen journalists, as people that were there for it, that were filming these things. And even in our little pre-roll intro, we have some footage from my walkabouts there and some other things that happened in Ottawa, and it was just so there was so much to see. So how do you use that to tell a visual story when there is just so much that you can choose from as far as available footage, plus what you filmed yourself making it?
I think it comes down to incorporating the footage at the right point. I mean, you gotta lead them to it. So you'll find we try to set the stage, and because it's impossible to recreate that atmosphere. That's one thing I definitely caught in the footage. It's just the magnitude, the size of the crowd, and the amount of different activities going on. There were stages, bouncy castles. It was a carnival that just sort of just flooded the streets. And so, it was very important that we try to encapsulate the atmosphere without trying to do so in a way that seemed overly biased in its presentation. And so, yeah, I think it's just, fluttered in delicately and appropriately.
The convoy was 3 weeks in Ottawa, plus the week it was on its way to Ottawa, plus you had the spin-off events that took place in Coots and Windsor and Emerson and Surrey. You had the Emergencies Act, you had the Public Order Emergency Commission. You have so many different threads here between the legal, the political, the cultural, the chronological, the media bias. Which angle is it that you're exploring? And I don't mean it in terms of which perspective, but I guess which strain of this story were you trying to follow?
Yeah, that was something we struggled with because there was just so much to cover. And I think initially we went into it a little bit blindly and tried to ask our sources about a lot of different things. We definitely only focused on the Freedom Convoy within Ottawa. We didn't touch on any of the spin-off stuff. Those are all well worth their own, full-length documentaries. There was so much material here to cover. We really covered, the mainstream media job of covering the Freedom Convoy, and if they did an adequate job of covering that. We also covered the police's work on pushing protesters off of Parliament Hill and what that looked like, and also, how that was spurred by the Emergencies Act, and sort of raised the question, was the Emergency Act justified in its invocation? So I think really the mainstream media job of covering the Freedom Convoy and how that went about, and maybe some of the misinformation or bias that was caught in there. I mean, obviously we'll have some sources within the doc say they think the mainstream media did a very adequate job of covering the convoy, as well as some of the violence that we saw in protesters actually being pushed out, and really what the next step is moving forward.
Let's broaden this discussion a little bit to include my colleague at True North, Rupa Subramanya, who also is a co-guest, a co-interviewee of the documentary. And if you're just tuning in, the premiere is going to be coming in about 15 minutes or so. So you haven't missed it. We're going to have a little bit more in the sense of pre-discussion. We'll premiere the documentary for you, and then we'll have some post-analysis as well. Rupa, you and I have spoken about this before. You were one of the only journalists that came up with this revolutionary concept of talking to people, which before the convoy wasn't a revolutionary concept, but during it, no one but you seemed to be interested in doing it. So how do you feel now that this story is being told by more people and in a different way than when you were just walking around alone, having conversations and tweeting about them, basically?
It's a real pleasure that it's a privilege that we're able to premiere this documentary, and that I was part of it, and along with you, Andrew. Well, that's interesting. Basically what I did was, I was just chatting with people. I had no agenda. I was just having a conversation with people, and I ended up speaking to a whole bunch of people over the course of 3 weeks. And it's important that the story gets told over and over and over again. Especially those of us in the independent media space, because it was such an important point, in our history. It was one of the world's greatest protests, in my opinion, for various reasons, and I think the fact that Rachel and Johnny have this amazing documentary out is one important way of chronicling what happened in February of 2022, February of 2022. And I know there are other documentaries out there as well. I know there are people working on books and documentaries and films, and that's pretty amazing. And the more the better, in my opinion.
Johnny, I know that there's this perception, and I think it's perhaps a little bit deserved, maybe not as much as people think, that the film industry is this overwhelmingly left-wing environment. And I'm just curious, I know you're starting out your career, but if any of your colleagues in the film industry just kind of had their backs up against the wall when they learned you were working on this sort of project.
Well, I mean, I didn't have anyone's back to the wall, but I did try to preview it across a couple of colleagues of mine, and unfortunately, you're not wrong. It is a very left-leaning industry, and there were some turn downs. Unfortunately, some people just felt too, politically charged, or it was too triggering for them to even reopen the can of worms, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, I would say those reservations that you have of the film industry are absolutely accurate. Is what it is, though. We're trying to challenge that.
What do you make of that, Rachel? That there are some people that, whether they're in the film industry or not, that just have this baked-in narrative where they don't even want to learn more about it. I mean, with my book, I encounter that. People that said, no, I know everything I need to know. I don't want to read the book. And, there are going to be some people that say, no, I already know I don't like them. I don't need a documentary to tell me anything about it. But do you think they're the minority, and that most people actually could have an open mind about this?
Yes, I do think they're the minority, and I think that it's important for us not to get so held up on these people that don't want to give us the time of day and don't want to have discourse and these conversations, that we don't forget that there are a lot of people who are critical thinkers and are willing to hear both sides of the stories, and not forget to appeal to those people as well. And sometimes we can get so turned off by the other side, so to speak, that, we kind of forget to stop trying and just kind of exist within our own worlds. But politics is downstream of culture, and I think it's important, and this is just, I think, a general life rule, that when you go around in your society, that you're the type of person that is willing to engage with other people from all walks of life. And I think that if we want to see change in our political sphere, it needs to start with us and how we interact in our communities. And just to sort of add to what Jonathan was saying, there was actually quite a funny instance, because he had asked someone to review the project for us, and I think they got about 7 minutes into it. And then they turned it off and said they just couldn't watch it. It was just apparently too biased, which was hilarious thinking about it now. But at the time, I think we were both like, what are we going to do? And I think it actually led to a whole reworking of the intro. So, but yeah, I mean, I think probably in retrospect, I don't know how much it is really worth to appeal to these type of people that obviously are not interested in having the conversation to begin with.
Let me ask you this question, Rupa, because you, like me, are going into this a bit blind. So you know the story of the convoy through the lens that you've approached it with, but you haven't seen the documentary. What are the questions that you would have as a viewer that you would like this documentary to answer, or at least contribute to the discourse around?
Well, I think you started off by asking a very interesting question, and this is a question I've been getting from many people from in anticipation of this of the documentary premiering this evening. Is that why the word occupation in the title? And Rachel's answer to that was, I think, struck the right balance, and I sense that that's what the documentary is going to be doing. I think it's going to be a conversation starter, which is a great, which is what I would like to happen. Look, unfortunately we're all in this echo chamber. We all agree with each other. We all agree that the Freedom Convoy was one of the greatest protests. It was a legitimate right. They had a legitimate right to civil disobedience, to protest. They were peaceful. Andrew, you and I spoke to, hundreds of people during the protests over those 3 weeks. And since then, we've spoken to many more, and we've covered this quite extensively. So there's no question that you and I agree that what the protests were about. But I really think it's important for us to get out of our echo chamber and invite more people into the conversation, because that's what's lacking right now, in my opinion. It's become so incredibly polarized that everybody seems to just be in their own corner, when in fact what I want people to do is I want them to come to the middle on the issue. Yes, I mean, people were inconvenienced in Ottawa. I live in Ottawa. I live in downtown Ottawa. For that first weekend, I certainly was inconvenienced. It was quite loud. There was no question about it. I'm 100% honest about it. But at the same time, I think that the right to protest and civil disobedience is integral to a well-functioning democracy. Without that, we don't have anything. And these were people who were standing up for our basic rights, and courageously so, and I applaud them for it. But I think it's also important, and I'm hoping that Rachel's documentary, as she says, it's going to be a conversation starter. I'm hoping that that's precisely what it does, because we need to bring in more people onto to the middle and see the protests for what they were. These were not a bunch of Jagmeet Singh. These were not people who are here to overthrow the government. FYI, even the public order, the commission into the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act, all of the top police chiefs, the OPP, the RCMP, CSIS, everybody agreed that this was basically a peaceful protest, and there was no security threat to the country, and I think that needs to be established firmly, and invite more people into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Rachel, that you wanted to start a conversation about it, and my colleague tells me that in the comment section you've certainly done that, because there's a very raucous debate going on about the word occupation now. So before they've even seen it, I think you've achieved part of your mission there. I don't know, Rachel or Johnny, if one or both of you wants to take this specifically, but one question that I would ask, because you've been working on this for such a long time, the convoy was 13 months ago that it began. You started working on this not long after it, so you've had, let's say, almost a year here. Has your perspective or approach either on the event itself or how to cover it changed in the time that you've been working on it?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I wouldn't say so. I think there was a period in the summer where we had done our first half of filming in Ottawa. I had flown back to Ottawa. I'd already been living in Alberta at this point. Jonathan met me there. We did our first half of filming, and I think that was in the early stages of the project, and things at that point were coming together really well. And then there was a lull where summer got really busy. Here in Alberta, we had the United Conservative Party leadership race that I was pretty busy with, and Jonathan was pretty busy. And we kind of put it to the side for a pretty long time. And I think we both had a moment of, is this actually going to happen? Is this going to get finished? But Jonathan had looked over a lot of the footage at this point, and he said, no, we have something really good here. We need to make sure that we use this. But it was extremely complicated and difficult to find sources that were not pro-convoy convoy to come in the documentary. I would say that was actually one of the biggest challenges that we had, because I was reaching out and asking people to do the interviews, and people knew who I was, and there was a lot of people on the left who, if I had asked them a couple months earlier while I had still worked within the mainstream media, I'm sure they would have agreed to an interview. But a few short weeks later, I had made my position known, and so that was really challenging. And we had a moment where I think we were going to maybe just do the documentary in a different style, because we didn't think that we could get the interviews. And then sort of at the last minute, we were able to secure a couple and get that balance that we were looking for. But I think, other than that brief lull, we were pretty focused on what we wanted to do. And then the only thing was just what footage to include and what topics to cover. Because as we've mentioned, there's so much, and I'm glad there's so much being made about it, because there's so many unique aspects to the convoys and so many unique stories, even within this one broader story, that need to be told. And, Rupa was one of those people who was on the streets interviewing truckers all the time. And I think it's great we got so many of those stories out there, but there's still a lot we don't know, and there's still a lot to be told.
Does that track with your experience, Johnny, as well?
Yeah, it's similar. I'd say, like, when I initially, the mindset has always kind of been the same in terms of why we set out to do this. But how we wanted to say it, I think, was what actually evolved, in the sense of originally the idea was to sort of keep our voices out of the film as much as possible. We wanted to go with a completely objective approach in order to sort of appeal to both sides. But further on, as the project progressed, I sort of realized, like this, that loses the artistic touch that filmmakers bring to their craft. Your voice needs to be at least shared in a artistic way. And, if you have something to say, then you should say it. I think it's how you go about saying it, which is really important. So, originally it was like, try to stay as unbiased and objective as possible, but then it sort of came down to, it's like, no, there's a message behind this, and we do stand behind the trucker convoy, and that should resonate with viewers.
I do think that issue you identified, Rachel, is a fascinating one, of having difficulty finding sources coming that wanted to criticize it. I know Justin Ling, the freelance journalist, is in this, and he and I, despite drastically different approaches to the world, have gotten along and have interviewed each other and without issue. And every time we have, each of our respective supporters is mortified that we dare talk to the other. So when he had me on to talk about my book, his audience are like, I'm unsubscribing, you're platforming that terrible person, that convoy propagandist. And I had people saying, how dare you talk to him, you're a sellout. And I do think that that's been one of the problems with the convoy, is that there have been a lot of people that have their baked-in perspective. They refuse to not even just agree with the other side, but just respect that there is another side. And I get from what you've said, Rachel, that you're not trying to force people to believe a certain thing, but do you want people to at least say, I understand the other perspective a bit more. I understand where they're coming from a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we spoke about earlier, just that need to still be willing to have dialogues with people that you don't agree with. And, you mentioned some of your subscribers saying, oh, I'm unsubscribing, like I'm disappointed that you would have an interview with Justin Ling. But I think that's kind of what we don't want to lose. We don't want to lose that ability to have dialogue with one another. I don't think we're going to see the progress in our country that we want to see if that's the attitude that we have. And, I actually reached out to Justin Ling on Andrew's sort of suggestion. I mentioned I'm having a really hard time finding, someone who's going to be critical of the convoy. And, Andrew suggested Justin, and he agreed to it, which I was pleasantly surprised to. I think that our viewers will also be, a bit surprised. I felt he actually gave, really reasonable at times, really reasonable sort of perspective on things. He gave a really good analysis of mainstream media coverage of it a lot of times. So I don't think people will be I think people might be pleasantly surprised at times. There was other things that he said that I know people will be really upset by, but I felt like he was actually a pretty strong voice for the middle throughout the convoy. And maybe you have a different perspective, Jonathan, but we did have another voice in the project who was much more against the convoy, but I felt like Justin did a good job of sort of presenting what people in the middle would have felt.
Jonathan, did you want to pick that up?
No, yeah, I think she nailed it. I mean, he was a very balanced voice.
Oh, you've called Justin Ling balanced now. I don't even think Justin Ling wants that endorsement from True North, but we'll slide. Rupa, one thing that we mentioned earlier was your conversations with people and putting a human face on this. And I think that was always one of the big challenges for people in the country that wanted to get news about the convoy, is that you had the media that was saying Pat King is the face of the convoy or James Botter is the face of the convoy. And you had thousands and tens of thousands, and if you extend it to people that were just supporters or observers, millions of people who were never in the news. Their faces were not known. Their names were not known. Their stories were not known. But they were a big part of this. And I would actually say they were the real backbone of the convoy. Not the people at the top or the people the media like to say were at the top, but the real people that aligned with this movement. And it's been very difficult for those people's stories to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was what made the protests for me. I did interact with some of the convoy organizers over the course of those 3 weeks. I went to some of their pressers, but to be fair to them, they didn't really. They also kind of stayed in the background, and let the protest speak for itself. And I thought that was very interesting, because oftentimes when you have when you have a large protest movement like this, you have organizers who want to just basically hijack the movement, and they become the face of the protests, and nobody cares about the protesters themselves or even the cause for that matter. But what ended up happening here was that it was actually focused on the average Canadian who showed up to protest. And those are the people that I spoke to from the first day I stepped out of my apartment here in Ottawa to the very end. I was there till the very end, till when law enforcement was, they were pushing the protesters back. I stayed till that last day, and it was all about them. It was all about these people who had journeyed from all over the country, from Alberta, from New Brunswick, from Newfoundland, from Quebec, from everywhere. And they all spoke one common language, and that language was of freedom. And it was an extraordinary moment in this country. And what was sad and disappointing, there were many sad and disappointing aspects of those 3 weeks, one of them being the media coverage of it. I didn't think any of it was really balanced. They had an agenda right from the get-go, and they kept doubling down on that agenda. And of course, what led to, what led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was unnecessary, and it was highly problematic. But through it all, it was a very Canadian protest, and that needs to be emphasized over and over again, because these were peaceful people coming, doubling down on love and joy and peace and hope and freedom, whereas the other guys were doubling down on hate, vilification of the other, and denigration of the other, and that contrast was quite striking to me, and that's still going on to this day. I mean, if I say anything positive about the freedom protests, a year later, I still get a lot of hate saying that this was an occupation, and these were terrorists, and they were here to overthrow the government. But that just shows you how polarized everything has become in this country, how divisive everything has become. And this is why it's extremely important that we strike a balance somehow. And it's great that you and Rachel reached out to Justin Ling, and you've had a conversation with them, or more than a conversation here and there. But I think that that kind of reaching across the aisle, so to speak, is extremely important as we go forward, because I don't think it's sustainable the way things are right now, where everybody is just hating the other. I don't think that makes for a good future, as far as I'm concerned.
All right. Well, very, very wonderful note to wind down our pre-show discussion here. Just before we get to the main event, I'll go back to the filmmakers here, Rachel and Johnny. Anything you want to say to set the scene before we roll your documentary for the first time?
I think
Is that a no?
Enjoy. Sorry.
I can't actually see you for where I'm looking right now. So if you were shaking your head, I missed it. But hearing no comments, as they say in the House of Commons, it is my great privilege on behalf of the True North team and the filmmakers from Emmanuel Productions here to present for the first time The Freedom Occupation, the movement that fueled a nation.
I gotta step away for like half a second, but you can reach me on Slack.
Growing anxiety this morning about the COVID-19 trend in Canada as we take a look at the numbers.
Residents to exercise caution
the CDC
over the coming
said it
weeks.
is working on new
An
guidance
increase
for
in
mask
community
wearing.
spread is
Before you
leading
go
to
anywhere,
more
you're going to
and
need a
larger
COVID.
outbreaks.
The federal government is warning the rules may
Ottawa
change
Mayor
again.
Jim Watson is declaring a state of emergency to give the city more flexibility.
Ottawa has declared a state of emergency after
the city of Ottawa has declared a state of emergency.
That's because of ongoing protests there by truck drivers and their supporters.
It's being blocked by truckers protesting vaccine rules.
But what's currently happening there is unprecedented.
So over the last 2 weeks have tried tactics never seen before in Canada.
People were coming out and supporting this because they knew they had to.
All Canadians must act now.
And the potential for destruction was huge.
The convoy is attracting supporters with a wide range of views.
And I thought to myself, well, they've really misjudged the moment.
The folks who lived in the downtown core were terrorized.
It was clear there was no justification for it.
You don't just show up with all these trucks and take over downtown.
I don't believe it became illegal until the Emergencies Act was actually put in place. They needed to use the Emergencies Act to declare the protest illegal.
Yeah, I can describe what it was like pulling into Ottawa with a convoy.
It was unbelievable. The emotions were crazy busy, trying to be organized, not knowing how many trucks, cars were behind you was an awesome feeling.
The excitement level was really high for everybody. I had my son in the truck with me, and yeah, he wanted the horn being honked all the time.
It was just an emotional wow in the fact that there was so many people with flags standing on the bridges. And yeah, it brought emotions out that my wife and I will never experience again. It was a beautiful, exciting time.
The Freedom Convoy happened because you had this growing segment of the population that was absolutely tired of COVID restrictions, not just from the federal government and the provincial government, but I think a lot of the narratives around them that we saw increasingly with the convoy even. I mean, Justin Trudeau calling them a fringe minority, going back early in Ontario to being called a bunch of yahoos. So people felt like they were increasingly being excluded from society. And the convoy wasn't just a protest against the restrictions themselves, but I think also the media's depictions of the people that were forming the convoy.
I'm here because on January 26, 2022, I lost my nursing job after 12 years.
Yeah, when the truckers first arrived, it was more of a novelty. And the reason is I think most people were under the impression, I wouldn't say to what extent they'd been led to believe, but they were under the impression that this was going to last a weekend.
I really didn't know if it was going to last more than a weekend or not. From my mind, it was 50-50. There were folks who seemed a little bit less committed to the cause, who wanted to come out and protest against vaccine mandates, in some cases against vaccines, against lockdowns, against masks, mask mandates. And it wasn't clear whether or not the majority were folks who were more dedicated, more hardcore, more willing to sacrifice, or whether it was folks who just wanted a big public demonstration, a protest, some civil disobedience, but really it could have gone many different directions.
A lot of people are losing their jobs and their livelihoods. That's not okay, so.
I'm here because I would like to see change happen, and I want to see it done in a peaceful manner. I think this is a great way to do it.
This is democracy. This is what democracy is all about. People believe that the government has overstepped with mandates, and they're here to exercise their democratic right.
Yeah, I joined the convoy because we've been having a frustrating 2 years. Society has been, COVID definitely has been tough on society, and the restrictions have been tough as well. As the information comes out, we can see that they're not working. They actually are doing more harm than good. So that's why we decided to join the convoy, thought it was a protest that we could support.
That was incredible. It's hard not to look back and just smile about that, right? There was joy, peace, kindness. Canadians are just beauties. I mean, at the end of the day, that was like Canada Day on steroids.
This is affecting all of us, so it's a widespread thing. It's not just one community.
I think a lot of Canadians are worried about what's happening with our country and are worried about the direction that policies are heading.
Don't be controlled by the government. We are the ones that control ourselves.
Because if it's lost, you know, the next generation won't be around. That's all it is.
This is not what happened. These people came with very big machines. They came with huge trucks. Most of them had they were transport trucks. They were big. And the potential for destruction was huge. Like, I remember thinking that if ever anything happened, if ever any of these people decided that they were going to be violent, the damage would have been enormous. And what I mean is, if you have these trucks, they can easily be destroying buildings, destroying Parliament Hill. They could destroy anything. Nothing will stop these trucks. And I remember walking from my car where I was parked, because obviously I couldn't come downtown. So I was parked in the market and I would walk. And I was walking, and I remember, and it didn't take very long, that it was tantamount to a war zone.
I don't know if it's fair to say that Ottawa residents were genuinely concerned for their safety with it. I think certainly there was an uncertainty when this all started of what it was going to look like, because you had the media that was advancing this narrative of a January 6th style insurrection, of some violent protest.
Look at what happened in the States on January 6th. What happened? A bunch of people decided they were going to storm Congress, which is what they did. Now, what is the difference between that situation and ours?
At first they came for the pastors, and then the owners of the businesses, and then the frontline workers, and now they have touched the nerve because here are the truckers.
I tend to agree with CSIS's assessment, the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, which is kind of an open source reporting mechanism that reports to police, reports to domestic law enforcement agencies. It basically said there was no concrete threat, there was nobody proposing an attack, but that the possibility of an individual going rogue, an individual committing attack, was present. At no point did I see any of the organizers, any of the organizations at the core of this talk about any sort of direct state violence or start putting together the pieces that would be necessary to carry out an attack like that. Nothing I saw there led me to believe that an attack was imminent, but the conditions were right for someone to lose it.
And I remember that there were these individuals that were on different corners. All of a sudden they'd step out of a car, and their purpose was to intimidate me. I remember them looking at me, trying to give the impression that they were sort of in control. To what extent did I have a right to be there? And that was scary. It was scary because when that would happen, I was always thinking it wouldn't take much and it wouldn't take long. And I mean that because when you look at all the violence that has occurred, great moments of violence in the history of Canada and North America, it all starts with a little something happening. And that little something could have happened any time, and the consequences would have been huge.
Yeah, the residents of Ottawa feeling unsafe, I just have a hard time understanding where that came from. I feel like they should have come to the protest and seen it for themselves. They must have been listening to too much of the legacy media, because you couldn't have been there and felt there wasn't a sense of peace.
Lord, we ask that you would undertake. Father, you are able to do it, dear Father. Help her, dear God. Lord.
They should have showed up.
When I got to Ottawa, I flew into Ottawa because I just didn't know if I'd be able to drive in or drive out with the traffic. My taxi driver was nervous about driving downtown because he had heard, and he was listening to CBC radio, which may have contributed, but he was nervous and said, well, I might not be able to drive you up there, not because of traffic, but because of safety. So I think that people were being told to be a lot more worried than the situation warranted. One of the big frustrations I had is that the media's coverage of the convoy went through different stages. At first, they just completely ignored it. And then they were speaking about it in a way that made it clear they didn't really understand what it was about. I mean, some of the early coverage, anti-vaccine protests, which was never the case. It was an anti-vaccine mandate protest. And then the violent narrative.
So large sections of the mainstream media failed to cover the protests objectively. They were pushing a narrative, an agenda, which was contrary to anything that I had experienced for the 3 weeks that the protesters were here. There was a dereliction of duty. This was an important moment in this country's cultural history, and they were not covering it. They were covering something else.
In this current crisis with Russia, I don't know if it's far-fetched to ask, but there is concern that Russian actors could be continuing to fuel things as this protest grows, but perhaps even instigating it from the outset.
So it was clear that they were missing the mark at every stage of it. When I started covering it and was comparing what I was seeing on the ground with the media coverage I'd see when I went back on my computer, I was astonished at how two people could look at the same situation and draw such vastly different conclusions. And I think one of the biggest examples of this is the media's focus on these little outliers that really didn't characterize the convoy story, like the Terry Fox statue, or the so-called stealing food from the homeless incident, or the stuff at the War Memorial, or this attempted arson in an apartment building. All of these things that either did not happen or did not happen in the way that they were reported.
So the attempted arson story was, I think, a turning point in the protests because a few days later, the Prime Minister decided to invoke the Emergencies Act because the incident spoke to the safety aspects of the protests, where residents said that they were afraid of stepping out of their homes. And they attributed this to the protesters in very explicit terms. Very quickly, as soon as this post became viral, the politicians, including the mayor of the city, several journalists, also gave oxygen to this allegation that the protesters were behind this attempted arson. The police hadn't even begun their investigation at this point. It was still very early days, but already this narrative had taken hold that residents of the city were unsafe and that the protesters were going around setting buildings on fire.
Yesterday, we learned of a horrific story that clearly demonstrates the malicious intent of these protesters occupying our city. At 5 a.m., and this was captured on the building's video, on Sunday morning, two young men in the lobby of the building on Lisgar Street, where they proceeded to light fire starter bricks near the elevators before taping up the door handles so residents would struggle to get out during a fire.
When the police concluded their investigation, they said that the alleged arsonist had nothing to do with the protesters or the truckers. So that story was effectively debunked, and I can think of several other such stories that just, were debunked in very similar ways.
There was a story early on, I think it was like the first day or the second day when the convoy had arrived in Ottawa, that there was a report that convoy protesters had been stealing food from a homeless shelter. And I mean, certainly it's entirely possible that a couple of people that arrived at the convoy went to a homeless shelter and caused damage. But what was missing from that story is that as soon as convoy organizers learned that there was a supposed incident, they flooded this shelter with food. They brought so much food that to this and other shelters that they were said, we can't accommodate all of this. And then they were firing up grills on the street and feeding the homeless for weeks, and in some cases, even housing homeless people. So it was a very significant misrepresentation of the atmosphere that the convoy supporters and organizers tried to cultivate, which was one of giving, not taking.
Oh, peace and love out here.
Absolutely.
Nobody's been disrespectful at all. You got people walking around picking up garbage that's on the ground.
You get to see
Everybody's having fun,
smiles.
smiling, enjoying seeing people's faces.
Think about the Terry Fox story. What the media did with the Terry Fox story is just indescribable, really. Somebody put a sign on him and a Canadian flag. How many times have we not seen Terry Fox dressed in other protests? It's a bit of an unfair, description.
There was times when the coverage lacked curiosity, where you had reporters who would hear one of the organizers say, "I'm not against vaccines," and then the mainstream press would go and say, "Well, the organizers aren't necessarily against vaccines." We know that's nonsense. Without fail, every single one of the organizers, the main influencers in this convoy were anti-vaccines and spread anti-vaccine misinformation. So I think in some cases, the mainstream media was not critical enough of the convoy, the organizers, the influencers. But there was also a ton of instances where mainstream coverage was critical to a lazy degree. You saw this rhetoric that foreign money, that maybe Russian disinformation was feeding the convoy. There's virtually zero basis for that. I don't think we've identified a single dollar of Russian money that wound up anywhere around the convoy or the occupation.
I've seen nothing since the mainstream coverage of the media to lead me to believe that what was being covered was not true. In fact, what I've seen more of an attempt by the organizers, and I use the word organizers loosely, those that were the face of the protest, trying to, in fact, change the narrative as to what was actually being said and being done at the time the convoy was in place or was basically anchored here in Ottawa.
There was also instances where it was reported sort of without caveat that the whole movement was leading insurrection or that the entire occupation was there to overturn the government. There's a lot of nuance required when you introduce an idea like that, because yes, at the core of the convoy was a document that basically sought to supplant the democratic government of Canada. That is accurate. There are individuals who wanted to remove the government and try them for treason. There is a running theory inside the convoy that the government was illegitimate or undemocratic or ought to be deposed. You can report on that. But to just say writ large the entire aim of the movement is to overturn the government, to lead an insurrection, it's not factually accurate.
People give the government the power to act in accordance with their values.
Nobody should be forced to take an experimental treatment. And, it's a matter of personal choice.
The government does not have any independent power. It is us that confer the power on the government. And where they overstep, the people have a right to voice their opinions.
So there's a lot of questions need to be answered about public health in this country.
And the people have had enough.
Freedom!
What I think about the Nazi paraphernalia that came to the protest is you're gonna have a bad apple in every crew. I cannot imagine a single protest where you don't have a goofball. I have a hard time believing that it was a true protester. I believe it was probably a plant I'll never be able to prove that, but they didn't stick around long. So you have to imagine that it was there for the photo op and carry on.
They're almost under the impression, it seems to me, and that's what they're trying to portray, that what we're looking at in this whole, in the hearings under the Emergency Act, is we're trying to determine whether or not what they did was justified. That's not at all what's going on. It's clear that what they did was not justified. The question becomes, was it sufficient, what they were doing that was not justified, to invoke the Emergency Act? That's the question.
After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations.
So on that Friday of the last weekend, basically the last Friday of the convoy, I was quite taken by how slowly it was moving in the morning. Obviously, police were showing up from all across the country. They were moving themselves into formations, and starting a few blocks east of Parliament Hill, down at the Rideau and Sussex area, police were moving forward, but it was ever so slowly. They'd advance, maybe 6-8 feet every 10 to 15 minutes. And they would do this all morning, so much so that it took hours and hours, and they had barely covered any ground at all.
The people who hate you and want police defunded, and they'll Monday morning quarterback every arrest you ever make.
So looking at that, a lot of the protesters were saying, well, we've got all weekend. They're not gonna even get to Parliament Hill this weekend, let alone break it up. Obviously, we know that wasn't the case. On the Friday morning, most of the interactions I saw between police and protesters were fairly normal. Police had their line, they were moving people forward. Every now and then you'd get a protester that didn't want to move back, and they get pushed back with a baton at least. But it looked fairly standard for, riot policing. And I don't mean riot describing it, but just the way that police call it. And that, by the afternoon, had changed. More people had shown up in Ottawa. There had been more tension. There was more law enforcement. It stopped looking like a standard policing operation. And to a lot of people, started looking like a military operation, just because of the formations and the uniforms and the refusal by a lot of police to even, speak to protesters. There was just this stone-faced approach.
In the House of Commons, they asked us to bolster our name. I grew up a member of Parliament. They didn't do nothing.
Police in Canada are too quick to use force in crowd control situations. I think the use of mounted units, officers on horseback, is one of the most stupid and dangerous things a police service can do in a volatile crowd situation like this. It was incredibly dangerous. It was done to try and push back a crowd in a way that was completely not warranted, and it led to a woman getting injured.
Oh, come on through. Come on through. What is happening here? Wow, what is this lady doing? Trampling horses. Struggling. Stop it. Stop it. Oh my God. Oh my God.
I mean, we've all seen the viral video of Candace Cerro getting trampled by the horses. She had her mobility walker knocked down and then she was trampled and she sustained injuries. My office is looking into that matter, and there's more details that we have to uncover before I can comment further.
I can tell you that the police in Ottawa, while not perfect, used force at a significantly lower rate than I've seen most police forces in this country use force against large crowds.
I don't think peacefully protesting warrants being pepper sprayed. I think anyone that was being violent with police, anyone that was pushing back against police, obviously is fair game for police to respond and try to de-escalate that situation. But the reality is people who were doing their best to get out of the way were getting caught up in this. And that's the problem. These tactics are supposed to be used when police are trying to clear a space. If people are already moving, people are already walking back, there's no justification to deploy them.
Sideways, pull sideways. All right.
Certainly there was police violence. And I mean, people can argue about whether it was justified or unjustified, but we know from the incident of police horses trampling a woman, from protesters getting pepper sprayed, from tear gas being fired into the crowds, absolutely there was violence. And I know personally that you didn't need to be committing violence to be targeted by it.
It's hard to answer that question because I think the police have their training and they know how they would normally act. But in addition to having their training and their judgment and their discretion, they also have their marching orders from the higher ranking officers.
There was virtually no, in fact, I think zero use of tear gas by the Ottawa Police Service. In fact, there was tear gas used by the protesters against the Ottawa Police Service. Pepper spray was used relatively limitedly. There were instances where officers used, I believe, the butt of the rifles or batons to hit people who were not moving along the front lines. There were some takedown and arrests. There were some projectile, I think, beadbag rounds fired into the crowd. I think each one of those instances should be investigated about whether or not that was an appropriate use of force, because I think we should hold the Ottawa Police Service to the highest possible standard and use this event as the baseline.
This isn't about the police. This is about the politicians. This is about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his failure, not the police's failure, but his failure.
I do not believe that the government had any right to remove protesters at all. It's a democratic society. We have the right to protest, especially in our capital. And the narrative that the government and the media wanted to push, that businesses couldn't be open, is absolutely nonsense. There was not a business that was blocked from being open if they had a desire to be open, other than the police's own concrete barriers.
Where we were at by the second week of February needed serious action. Was that the Emergencies Act? I think that was the thing available. I think the way it was deployed was relatively reasonable. I think the orders the federal government wrote to go with the act were irresponsible. They went too far. They allowed far too much latitude and jurisdiction for the federal government to seize and freeze assets. It was so geographically wide that I think it gave them nearly limitless power to break up demonstrations anywhere in the country. So I think there's bad things about it. I think at the end of the day, we're going to conclude that it was the right thing to do.
I don't believe it became illegal until the Emergencies Act was actually put in place. They needed to use the Emergencies Act to declare the protest illegal. Because in Canada, a protest is not illegal until it becomes a riot. And that could have been covered under the Riot Act of the Criminal Code. The fact that they couldn't use the Riot Act in the Criminal Code indicates to me that it was not an illegal protest until they invoked the Emergencies Act.
Also, it's important to note that during the protests, Ottawa police actually said that street crime had come down in Ottawa, and that makes a lot of sense to me because you had a lot of people walking around and in the city, and it wasn't desolate like it usually is in the dead of winter.
One of the requirements to invoke the Emergencies Act is that the existing tools, laws, enforcement agencies, that those existing tools had to be inadequate and incapable of addressing the so-called emergency. So there needed to be an emergency, and the existing laws needed to be inadequate. And yet every single charge that has come from the arrests laid that weekend have all been under existing laws. And powers that the police officers used were existing powers.
Well, to me, the protest was always legal in the fact that when we first got there, it was the Ottawa police that escorted us onto these streets. It was the Ottawa police that ensured that we kept roads open, which we did. At all times, there was always lanes open for emergency vehicles to get through. And even on the Monday, which I believe was Valentine's Day, I helped with a couple other of the organizers with the Ottawa police escort 15 more trucks up onto Wellington. So that was the Monday before the Friday where they said we were illegal. So to me, we were legal the whole time.
The issue is finished. So we now know what happened. Nobody knew what happened or what was going to happen when we invoked the Emergency Act. It ended up being that finally there wasn't as much violence as might have been anticipated. But when the police started to basically remove the protesters, if the protesters would have decided to put it in high gear and be as violent as they could, all of the powers that had been given to them by the Emergency Act would have been needed. And that's why, to me, it's clear there's no issue the government had to invoke the Emergency Act.
Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act for political purposes. The purpose of the Emergencies Act, again, is to have a tool when existing tools don't work. And Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act basically to appear strong in the public eye. But as you could see, that a few days after he invoked it, he didn't follow through with having the Emergencies Act ratified in the Senate, and ultimately withdrew his use of the Emergencies Act. So clearly it was a political tool.
We were not playing a game, but it seemed like the other team was not playing again within the rules. So then there's no use anymore. Saturday morning, the police started smashing windows on trucks and really beating people up. And we said, we've made our point. It's over. There's no use, more people getting hurt. So we decided to leave, and we did end up having a couple trucks stuck in and getting towed and windows smashed and everything.
I think at the time that the Prime Minister rescinded the Emergencies Act, it was clear there was no justification for it. And not that there had ever been a justification, but certainly days later, the supposed blockades that were in place to justify the Emergencies Act had been disbanded. The crisis was gone. The money ceased to be an issue. And I think he was very worried about what the Senate was going to do, which hadn't voted on it at the time, and also what Canadians were going to do. Because it's one thing if you concoct an emergency to justify all sorts of measures that the government put forward. It's another thing when you indefinitely keep that in place when there's nothing that even resembles a crisis.
More and more often, I'm coming to the conclusion that the evidence that the government used to justify invoking the act is news reports from the public sphere that are public information. And if they didn't have some sort of smoking gun evidence to justify the use of this act, and we're basing it completely off of news articles, many of which have had to be retracted since we found new evidence that indicates that it was false information, false allegations, I think that's going to be a big problem for the government if that's the evidence that they relied upon. I think it certainly was upsetting in a country like Canada where, we have a lot of freedoms to see police, pushing protesters out on the streets. And I think what a lot of Canadians, certainly what I think, is how could we have let this get to this point in the first place?
There was a point where I think a lot of people, myself included, were hopeful that the government would look at the truckers and say, maybe we miscalculated, maybe we misjudged this, but the federal government doubled down.
some of these people are living in a fantasy land of constructed conspiracies. And I don't know if I had hoped that maybe they had broken out of some of those between the end of the convoy and today, but they certainly haven't.
Yeah, how did I feel driving home? To be honest, at that time you're tired, you want to go home. It didn't feel like the job was done.
Yes, we did accomplish something. We woke up the world first of all, and it actually still was giving people hope that something would change, that things would get better.
But then the reception that we got in Niagara was unbelievable. Yeah, the support that we got from the community meant an awful lot. Oh, sorry. I can't think about that enough.
And having all these people on the side of the road standing there waving the flags again, saying thank you for doing what you did, gave me a little bit of closure, but you still wish that things would have gone different.
Yeah, I do feel like the convoy accomplished actually more than what we set out for. Obviously the mandates, the federal mandates are still there, but the community, at least here in Niagara region, is super unified. The support is amazing. I believe the mandates were there to try to disunify our country and keep people apart, and it's done the exact opposite with the convoy.
Deeply concerning that we have a significant number of people in this country who have detached from reality. But again, I get why people wind up there. They lost friends to suicide, they lost family members to illnesses, and they couldn't go visit them in the hospital. They couldn't go to their family member's funeral, their friend's funeral, and that was really tough on them. And I get that. I've been there too. I think a lot of us have been there. And they've been looking for explanations for how we got here. And they look at somewhere like the federal government, where the Prime Minister frequently attacks his critics as being conspiracy theorists, and frequently belittles and demonizes people who are not settled on the science. And I think they tend to pull back.
Our media, the health experts, they're not interested in what's good for every Canadian. They're just interested in what's good for their narrative. And there's a lot of things going on that we as Canadians need to realize. You can't trust the media, let alone your own government anymore.
So crazy! Yeah. Come on! Move out! Move out! Move out!
I mean, Trudeau, anytime someone has thought that he was just done and going to lose the election, he's won. So people shouldn't underestimate Justin Trudeau. He may not have the massive Trudeau-mania 2.0 popularity he had in 2015, but he's still resonating with voters. And even if you look at the 2021 election, a big part of what he was offering Canadians was more restrictions on the unvaccinated. He campaigned on firing public servants if they didn't get the COVID vaccine. He campaigned on banning unvaccinated Canadians from air and rail travel. So he's been quite transparent about what it is that he wanted to do. and Canadians rewarded that. Now, you can talk about whether this is because the Conservatives didn't put up their best and brightest, but clearly the scandal and frustration that a lot of people see in Trudeau isn't necessarily representative of how Canadians as a whole have seen him up until the last election. Now, whether that's changed since then is a different story.
You know, that's a good question. And I think a lot of it is going to ride upon the inquiry and the parliamentary review. And I think if it can be proven that the government inappropriately used the Emergencies Act, I think it's going to be remembered as a time when the government overreached on Canadians' rights, and it's going to look very bad on the current Liberal government.
I think the Freedom Convoy is going to be fairly divisive for a lot of people in how they remember it. Certainly, I've talked to a lot of people in my own work on this that think it was just the greatest moment of their lives. It was this time when the peasants took over the castle in a way, and ordinary people stood up and said, we're not going to take it anymore. But still, the narratives that were being passed off by the government, by the media, are still baked into a lot of people's perceptions of the convoy. And those people, as we've seen in a number of other stories that have come up since, are still very committed to this idea that it was a violent protest, that it was a lawless rebellion, which just wasn't the case. And the facts don't support that. But the stubbornness has persisted among some.
I think the convoy is going to be remembered very negatively. I think it will be seen as an outgrowth of the intense frustration and alienation that we all experienced during the pandemic, right? I don't think this will be our January 6th, right? I think that will be remembered very particularly in the US. I think this is going to be remembered as the sort of culmination of a kind of, intense anger and disenchantment and disaffection that, came to a head in 2022, and that in some cases is understandable, in some cases is really out to lunch, but I don't think it's going to be remembered particularly well.
I think the Freedom Convoy will be remembered by most Canadians as a very important moment in this country's history. But it also depends on who you speak to. The people who obviously supported the protest will romanticize the protest, and the people who oppose the protest will try to delegitimize it and denigrate it. But I hope that there's a mass of people in the center who will objectively sift through the facts and make up their own minds. And I personally think that it was an important moment in the fight for individual liberty and freedoms. That's what it was all about in the end. And we've lost a bit of that during the 2 years of the pandemic.
For the first time, that was The Freedom Occupation, a documentary that was produced by Rachel Emmanuel and Johnny Emmanuel. We are very proud at True North to present it to you now. And I was so glad to see that, like I mentioned at the beginning, I was seeing that for the first time here. So this reaction is all very authentic. We'll bring back our superstar panel now with Rachel Emmanuel and Johnny Emmanuel, as well as Rupa Subramanya. And to both you, Rachel and Johnny, firstly, congratulations. I went in, I will say with high expectations, but you met them and exceeded them. So very well done.
Thank you very much. Too kind.
So let me start with just a question about, I'm not going to nitpick and be like, well, why did you keep that frame up? No, it's nothing like that. But just as your approach, why did you decide to do this without a narrator, or without, perhaps you, Rachel, you are on camera all the time, without you sort of driving the story along? Why did you decide to just let your guests be the only voices in there?
Well, I think part of what Jonathan had said earlier in the pre-show was just initially maybe this desire not to include too much of our voices in it. I think also just the idea of having like a narrator talking underneath is maybe a bit of it is a technique that you can use in documentary making, maybe at times a bit more of an old-fashioned technique. I like the way that we do it. I think it was really progressive, and I think the pace moved really well throughout it. There was also just so much different types of footage that we had to include, like interviews, but also, some of the standalone interviews that you did while you were in Ottawa. And then, of course, some of the more aggressive footage when police were pushing protesters out. So we had the conversation, and we both immediately decided that we weren't interested in having a narrator, so to speak. There was a conversation about whether I was going to be in the documentary. If we felt like we needed to fill in any gaps, I think I would have maybe sat down for an interview and filled them in. But we just felt like we would have lost a little bit of credibility on the bias if I had been in the film. So we had so much footage to use, and I really wasn't needed. So we decided it was just easiest to leave me out because it wasn't needed. And I think we would have just lost a little bit of credibility on that end, most importantly.
When you mentioned that it was an old-fashioned tactic, that was like the kindest way possible for you to say, Andrew, you're an idiot that doesn't know how documentaries are produced in the last 20 years. So thank you for putting on the kid gloves there. But it was interesting, and even seeing my own comments, which I had forgotten what I said because we sat down so long ago. It was fascinating to see that juxtaposed with things that your other guests were saying, like the lawyer Kaza or Justin Ling, and same with Rupa's comments and getting the Jonkers in there and putting those together and having, in some cases, drastically different perspectives about the same events. And, at the end of it, I was reading some of the comments that came as the documentary was going, and some people are very offended by, oh, I don't like that Justin Ling said that, I don't like that the lawyer said that, but other people, I think, were very, it seemed like, just from what I was reading, trying to keep up with it, very grateful just to have that balance in it. And I hope that if people can get by their initial reaction that might be a bit more visceral if they don't like the convoy, they can see that this story is being told in a very fair way here.
Sure, and I think something that we mentioned for people who didn't tune in for the pre-show was just that idea of wanting to be able to keep the dialogue open and how much we lose as a society when we become unwilling to speak to the other side. And when I said that I thought, Justin Ling, some of his comments were very reasonable. I mean, some of the stuff he said, arguably, a lot of people wouldn't agree with. I myself wouldn't agree with. But he did make some points that I was like, you know what, I totally agree with that. You were bang on about that when he talked about the use of mounted units being used, and that was that was an incredibly stupid move. I think that was actually maybe his specific wording and other things he said. Those are points of his that I agree with, and I think that I've just become accustomed to looking for things that people say that I agree with, and that being the point of context that we can take the conversation for there. We might not have the same conclusions, we might not come to the same outcomes, but if you're so focused on that, you'll never be willing to have discussions with people. So if you're willing to hear what they say, and you're usually able to find something you agree on or some point of contact and start the conversation from there, you might be surprised with how far you can get in dialogues with other individuals.
At the beginning of this discussion, before the documentary, I had asked Rupa if she had any thoughts on what she as a viewer would like to see. And I was sort of asking myself that question as well. And you answered a question I didn't have, and one that I've never really talked about, even when I was interviewing truckers for my book and on my show and at other points. You asked a question in that documentary that was answered, which I think was a tremendous one, which was about the drive home. And I think so often we talk about the drive to Ottawa, we talk about what happened in Ottawa, but for a lot of those truckers, they then had, I mean, in the case of the Jonkers, a drive through Ontario, for other people, a drive across the country back to BC. And it was actually quite moving to see how he tried to reconcile what he was feeling after that, driving home with, in his words, a mission not accomplished.
Yeah, I felt like that was a really impactful moment of the doc as well, and it was really important to include that because we know that truckers had a really hard time with that. I personally know a couple truckers, and that was a really devastating moment for them. I think some of them really felt like they had failed, and I think for a long time the question was, should we go back? And I love that he gave a little shout out to Niagara there because I'm from Niagara and I love Niagara. Moving to Alberta, you know, people rag on Ontario a lot, but Niagara is truly one of the most incredible places on earth. It's in many ways a little slice of Alberta right there in Ontario, you know, great Christian community, a lot of conservatives. And so the freedom movement there was alive and well throughout the entire COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a very strong freedom movement there. So when they drove back to Niagara, he sort of mentions, you know, the community was great. And there was just people lining the streets ready to welcome the truckers home the same way they sent them off, because really what the convoy did accomplish, it did unite people. We didn't lose all the mandates. You know, some of the provinces were a bit more successful in seeing movement than others, but people were united and they realized for the first time in almost 2 years that they weren't alone in having these concerns. And I think that changed a lot of people's lives. Certainly it changed mine. You know, earlier we talked a little bit about why I wanted to do the documentary, but, you know, one of the things I didn't mention was I was working in the mainstream media at the time the convoy happened, and I felt very sort of bootstrapped with what I was able to write about and how I was able to cover things. And so this was my opportunity to go back and redo it in the way that I wish that I had done it while it was actually going on, and maybe set the record straight and also sort of clear my conscience in a sense, because I feel like I didn't do an adequate job of covering it while it was in Ottawa and while I was a reporter in Ottawa.
Let's get your first review here from Rupa Subramania. She is untarnished by not having seen it before, although a little bit biased because I think she bears a very close resemblance to someone who was featured in the documentary. But Rupa, first time seeing it, what were your thoughts?
Well, a flood of emotions, you know, came back to me. You know, I'd be lying if I said that the Freedom Convoy protests didn't change my life. It did, in personally and professionally, and I've spoken about that quite a bit. Congratulations, Rachel and Johnny. I think, you know, on a job well done. You know, I think you brought it all together. You know, people are going to object to, you know, having certain voices in the documentary, or even with the use of the term occupation in the title. But I think that you had to, you know, it goes back to the point that I was making earlier, which is, you know, we don't want to be stuck in these echo chambers. I mean, if you want to do a documentary on the protests, I think it is important to have voices who don't agree with those of us who had a different take, right? And I think it's important to to include those voices. We don't want to be the people on the left, you know, who are always trying to cancel the other side just because they disagree with a certain point of view. Having said that, I will say that I don't think Justin Ling is balanced. That minor quibble in the you know, when you said that, I disagree with a lot of what he's saying. Now, see, someone like Justin Ling was very prominent in promoting this narrative that these people were violent, the protesters were violent, that they were here to overthrow the government, and he kept that up. And then he's surprised that certain things happen later, where you know, the RCMP had to you know, where you know, there was this law enforcement came out in full force. Look, you can't have it both ways, right? You're on the one hand you're saying like this is like you know, these people are violent and something needs to be done, and then on the other hand you can't criticize the excessive use of force. And that's you know, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too, and I don't think you can do that. And so that's where I, you know, just a minor quibble there, but I think it's still important that he was part of the documentary. And the other voice, and the I think it was a professor or a lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, who also felt threatened by the protesters. I mean, that was representative of the kind of sentiment that people who opposed the protests were saying at that time, that they didn't feel safe stepping out of their apartment, out of their homes in Ottawa. So I think that it was important to include that voice. But what can I say? I mean, it just it was a very emotional experience for me. I know friends who are who suffered during the pandemic in more than I ever did, to be honest with you. These are people who were on leave without pay, and and they took this principled, courageous position to not take the vaccine, and we may not understand their reality, but I don't think you can denigrate their reality, and that's what ended up happening during the protests. We denigrated their reality, and we said that our reality is somehow superior to their reality, but we all live in our we all have our challenges, and all of that has to be taken into account. And
I just want to get to Johnny here, because he's been very silent since the documentary wrapped. And just, I mean, this was I love the pacing, by the way, Johnny. You kept this moving. Rachel, you kept this moving. I never felt it was dragging. You covered a lot of ground, but I also didn't feel it was lacking. But I know when we spoke, it was probably for 45 minutes to an hour. I assume it was very similar with your other guests. So you would have had, I mean, even just forgetting the B-roll and the footage you wanted to incorporate from the protest itself, just hours and hours and hours of interviews. How do you decide what makes it in? I mean, what was the process like to really pare this down and say, no, this is the essential 30 seconds we need?
That was definitely a challenge, and there's multiple drafts that we took to. There was in the structure of the story, at what point do we want to introduce what events? What is the through line here? And there's so much stuff that I would have loved to include into the doc, but we just had to sort of say we can't be branching off on little tangents, especially if we can't sort of solidify what we're trying to say about it. It's more of what do we have as concrete, and what are we really trying to put forward? And so what really resonated with the stories and the answers that we had, it was more or less the mainstream's misperception of the convoy itself. I think that's really resonated throughout the film, just these accounts of what they claimed versus what it was like. And I think it's very obvious in the B-roll that it was just nothing to the degree of what it was being described as. And so, yeah, I mean, deciding on what to keep really just became down to what are the important facts, what do we really want to make sure we get through, and that was more or less the truckers' account of the story, the media's perception, and then how the violence ensued and what that really meant for the occupation, what it meant for Canada as a whole. And so I really like how Rupa ends the film with that idea of it's important that we objectively sift through the facts ourselves and make up our mind, not just take the opinion that is given to us and stated as fact.
Well, and I also think on that point, ending with the question of legacy is a really, I think it's a fantastic artistic choice, but I think even just in the current climate in Canada, it's a valuable one. I wanted to read a comment I saw that now in our group chat is 300 pages behind. From here it is. Kay Luciano writes, "There will be a bronzed Kenworth on Wellington Street one day. Market." So I don't know if right next to the Terry Fox statue, they're going to just make a little space and put a statue of a truck there. I thought that was a beautifully put comment. So I thank you, Kay Luciano, for that, because it does suggest that at a certain point in time, and it won't necessarily be within the next year, the truckers will be remembered in history favorably. And I was talking on my show a little while ago about, this is going to be when the audience tunes out, so I'll make it very short. The Upper Canada Rebellion in 1837, and William Lyon Mackenzie goes from being a tyrant living in exile 2 years later being a member of Parliament. So the renegades and the traitors and the terrorists eventually can become the heroes in the story of Canada. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, even if that dynamic has changed a little bit in the time you've been working on this, Rachel or Johnny?
It's tough to say. I think we've all kind of talked a little bit about how the Emergencies Act Commission is coming out at this point, And I think I'm excited to see how what happens with that. It's hard to say if you've really seen people's perspective on the convoy change at this point. I think in our interview, something we felt was people had kind of dug in and they had kind of come to their own facts already. And, I think there is those people in the middle who are still kind of coming to their own conclusions. But it's tough to say at this point, and I still am interested to see how the convoy will be remembered. It's still relatively recent in Canadian history. And I think there's just, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot to know about it. But I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Johnny.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that it's remembered in a respectful manner, just because, I want to repeat something that Rupa mentioned earlier, just the national pride that I felt when the convoy actually took place. That was something that I hadn't really, felt in a really long time. And we were at the heat of COVID and lockdown, so it was really tough. But when that convoy started, I remember I was driving on the highway. I intersected a piece of it. And yeah, it was just really rejuvenating. I felt that sense of being proud to be Canadian. And I really hope we can, come back to that point.
Let me go to you on one part of the documentary, Rupa. One of the guests was talking about how it was a war zone and using these really dramatic, emotive terms. One of the points that you had made as someone who spent a great deal of your life in India, and you mentioned this back in January of last year, is that this was like a pale Mickey Mouse version of chaos. And you had, I believe, at one point said to me, just like look at like a day on the streets of India, and this looks like a cakewalk. So you've seen crisis, you've seen chaos. This was not it.
I have a fairly high tolerance for noise. Having lived in Mumbai, a city of 16 million people, that was pretty much my experience every time I opened the windows of my apartment, and you'd hear cars honking all the time. The streets are always bustling with life and that sort of thing. And I've said this many times. I originally come from the land of civil disobedience, the land of Mahatma Gandhi, and this was, you see a protest like this all the time in India, and the farmers' protest, and it's important to bring this in because the farmers' protests in India, which went on for a year and a half, which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau supported, had a very similar, they had a very similar approach. They blocked highways and roads with tractors and trucks and other vehicles. And this went on for about a year and a half. And Justin Trudeau defended the protesters' right to protest, as did I, by the way, even though I disagreed with their cause, because I actually believed in the Indian government's decision to carry out this reform. So my point is that what I saw here in Ottawa, yes, it was tame. It was. I don't even want to say it was tame, but it was not like anything that I hadn't seen before. But it was truly Canadian. It had that Canadian spirit, which was part of it. And as Johnny mentioned earlier, and as many immigrants have mentioned to me, that this was the first time in their entire time in India, in Canada, that they felt really proud to be Canadian, that they had a strong sense of what it meant to be Canadian, and that was very, very striking to me.
Here's a question that may infuriate you, Rachel and Johnny, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I asked you at the beginning if there was anything you didn't want to talk about and you didn't take the opportunity to give me something. So what almost made it in? If there was one more scene or one more section or 10 minutes more, what would have been in that wasn't?
I would have loved to dive deeper into the financial aspect of the convoy. I think that was a real hot topic that people really wanted to learn more about, I myself included, but we just didn't take the time to fully polish off that end of the narrative. And so putting the piece that we had in there would have felt like it was like just, it wasn't enough, it would have just been a sprinkle when we really needed the full meat. So
it's funny you mentioned that because when I wrote my book, I had the same thought, whereas I really wished that I had had access to a bit more. And I think I did as good a job as I could. A lot of that didn't really come out until the Public Order Emergency Commission, because there were so many different strains and tracking the cryptocurrency donations and Bitcoin donations. So I think on your part, you're forgiven for not doing that, because it's only been so recently that you could even tell that story. And it is a complex one. Rachel, what would yours be?
Perhaps very selfishly, mine would be something totally different. When we were in Ottawa filming the second time, it was in November, and it was one of those days where it felt like -20 with wind chill, and we decided to do a segment. For a while, we decided we were going to spend a lot more time on the dock of the police pushing protesters off of Parliament Hill. So we spent about 2 hours. It was, I think, like -20 with wind chill outside in the streets of Ottawa, basically filming, where basically I had all the footage, and we were going to then go to shots of me basically doing streeters and explaining what was happening in the tussling, and sort of just throw back to what the streets looked like on a regular day, and then throw back to the tussling. And so we spent a good 2 hours out there. Like, it was painful. I was so cold. And then, of course, we didn't even end up using any of that. So all that work for nothing. So selfishly, that was maybe the one thing. But yeah, I guess the other big thing was we didn't spend any time on the Public Order Emergency Commission. There was a lot of thought and plans that we were going to go back and have another interview, but it ended up being that we had so much footage and there wasn't really a need to cover that. So we decided to leave it out in the end.
Yeah, and just on the note of my own little role in this, we didn't talk about it. Well, we talked about it in the interview, and it wasn't in the documentary, specifically me getting pepper sprayed. But the fun fact of that is that it could have been you, Rachel, because you and I were chatting like 30 seconds before it happened, and you had the wherewithal to get out of Dodge, because I think you had to go back to work or go to do an interview, and then like 30 seconds later, I am pepper sprayed. So if you had any advanced knowledge of that, you could have looped me in, but it might have just been fortuitous timing on your part. But this raises an important point, though, because I was there. I was not doing anything wrong. Other journalists were there as well, exactly where I was. I wasn't there protesting. I was there reporting, and I ended up getting pepper sprayed. Alexa Lavoie of Rebel News got hit in the leg with a canister of tear gas. This happened. It's seen on camera. And that was one thing that I felt in the comments people were really calling out Justin Ling for, which is saying that there was no evidence of tear gas being used by the Ottawa Police Service. Now, I don't know if that was a technicality on his part, because maybe the tear gas came from one of the visiting police forces, or if he was just challenging that incident took place. But Rupa, what was your thought on that?
My thought on...
Well, on the comment that we get from people that there wasn't tear gas or pepper spray was not used indiscriminately.
Yeah, no, I look, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer. While I disagree with the invocation of the Emergencies Act for sure, and I disagree with with the kind of the force that we the full scale of law enforcement right here in downtown Ottawa, I would say that law enforcement by and large, I mean, it could have ended really badly. I think it could have been really bad, but I think everybody was, I think more or less there was a balance struck. I do know that on the final day, there were a few hundred people had gathered on Spark Street, and they were, just wanting to hang around and party. And I remember trying to go to that event actually that evening, but I almost made it. But then I saw all of these people coming back from the event, returning from the event, and they said they'd just been sprayed, they'd just been tear gassed, and rubber bullets had been fired on them. And in fact, I one of them even pointed it to me. He'd collected them in his hand, and so I think that, I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know what the full facts are here. I don't know what exactly happened. Was there an indiscriminate use of force? I hope there wasn't, but I'm just conjecturing that, given just how big the presence was in Ottawa, how big you had cops from Quebec, from Calgary, from everywhere, and it could have gone the other way, but it didn't. In fact, I think a lot of the cops were just, very reluctant to do this. As many of us have pointed this out, they had tears in their eyes. They didn't want to do this. They felt very guilty doing this, and so there was a lot of restraint, I think, on the part of law enforcement as well. It's unfortunate, Andrew, that you got pepper sprayed. In fact, I think I was very close to you, and as shortly after you got pepper sprayed, you came up to me and you said you got pepper sprayed, and I could see how red your eyes had become. I was right next to the Chateau Laurier, if you remember, and so that's very unfortunate. And what happened to Alexa at Rebel News, that was equally unfortunate. But as far as protests go, and a protest that went on for 3 weeks. It was relatively all very peaceful from both sides.
It's funny you mentioned the law enforcement angle, because one aspect of this that's, I think, quite interesting, and I would love to explore it further, is that a lot of protesters genuinely felt like the police were on their side, and some of them felt very blindsided or very betrayed when, police eventually started moving in and making arrests and whatnot. We are coming to the end of our time together in the post-premiere discussion of the Freedom Occupation, but I want to give the final words to the filmmakers, especially since they, as we were discussing earlier, kept their own literal voices out of the documentary. So any final thoughts? We'll start with you, Johnny, and then we'll wrap it up from Rachel.
Well, I just want to say thanks to everyone for taking the time. I hope we are able to, cause you to, reevaluate your perceived notion of the doc. And hopefully we have more projects to bring you guys in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that. I think sort of to Rupa's comments on police violence, I think one of the interesting thing that Dane Lloyd mentioned was, the responsibility for that really lies with the government. At the end of the day, the police were just doing what they were ordered. So ultimately, that police violence that we saw or didn't see, that's up for discussion. You can have a debate about that. But ultimately, that does lie with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's the one that needs to answer to that. But yes, I echo Jonathan's comments. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I'm sure over the next couple of days and weeks, we will build up the courage to read all of your comments. I'm going to have to come up with a much more succinct explanation for our documentary title to put in the comments, because my full explanation I don't think is going to fit. But thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. I would also just mention I had the fun part of this doc. I got to sort of organize interviews and request people, but Jonathan was really the person who spent maybe, 2 to 3 months doing all the editing work. So the fantastic visuals that we saw and all the clever editing, that fully is his doing. So a big shout out to him, who definitely did a lot of the legwork on this project.
Well, it is the first Emmanuel production, and hopefully not the last. And I think I speak on behalf of Candace Malcolm and the True North team that we're so thrilled we get the opportunity to distribute this. And again, this is something that we're obviously connected to as far as the story is concerned, but this took on a life of its own before True North got involved. And I was just a lowly participant, as was Rupa. And now I get to be emceeing the premiere. So thank you very much for including me and including my good side. I don't really have a good side, but not the really bad side, I guess. And to all of you who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for that. And you can check out the full documentary once again. We are going to upload it as a standalone, so you don't need to worry about me. Well, I guess you do in the documentary, but not this part of me. And that's going to be at freedomoccupation.ca, and lots more details about the project there. But congratulations again to Rachel and Johnny. Thank you, everyone, so much. God bless you, and have a great weekend.